Showtime! The Capital G Show starts right now.
What's up YouTube? Capital G here. So guys, today I'm talking about 5 things that we need more of in the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! These are just my personal opinions of cards or card effects that I think would be beneficial to the game and to how the game is played now. I think that a lot of these would, curb some of the broken plays. It would hinder some of, the more powerful, unfair plays in the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! It would balance things out. And some of these cards or card effects, we haven't seen good variations since like the pre-GX days. Okay, so the number one, I'll start off with this. Cards that stop mass special summoning. Alright, so when I look at mass special summoning, the first 2 cards that pop into my mind to counter them is number 1, Max C. Now, everybody would agree Max C is an incredibly balanced card. You give your opponent the option of continuing their play at the cost of you being able to generate, tons of hand advantage and being able to essentially replenish your options or your resources. The thing about Max C is it isn't always a deterrent. There are certain situations where, even Konami referenced this in one of their articles with Trifortress Ops. If you had like Gateway back in the Samurai days when it was at 3, you really didn't have a reason to stop. If you had Gateway, that was going to get you enough Kizans and Grandmasters to put 8k damage on board, and your opponent could have a hand of like 50 cards, but we all knew back then anyway, the only real reliable OTK, deterrent was Gores, and with Solemn Warning being at 3 in that format, it really wasn't that difficult to stop. So it just kind of shows that Max C is not the be-all, end-all when it comes to stopping OTKs. Not only do you have to draw your counter OTK card, but you have to hope that your opponent doesn't have a counter for that card, because things like Infernity Barrier or making Naturia Landois to stop a Swift Scarecrow, flipping over Vanity's Emptiness so your opponent can't drop Battle Fader, those all exist. Now, I really feel like Royal Oppression was the greatest resource that we had in the game as far as curbing mass special summoning when the card was at 3. I felt like, the only decks that ever ran 3 Oppression were slower paced anti-meta decks. These were decks that never needed to mass special summoning to do what they wanted to do and generally didn't rely on special summoning at all. That's why it didn't feel like it was a sack card, because when you see multiple Oppressions in a deck, you already knew what type of deck it was. And as the card went from 2 to 1, I felt like it became so much more luck-based, because then faster-paced decks started including it in their deck, and it felt like whoever got to Oppression first just, had an immense advantage over the other players. So I felt like Oppression was a really great tool, but only when it was at 3. Now, my personal solution would be making a hand trap very similar to Max C, that when you discard it to the graveyard, neither player can special summon for the rest of the turn. And I think that that's balanced because it's an inherent neg-1, but if you play it skillfully, it's probably going to be a 1-for-1. Your opponent activates Monster Reborn. Okay, you can chain this hand trap. It's going to resolve before the Monster Reborn. Your opponent cannot special summon, thus the Reborn's going to fizzle. And it would really curb a lot of the broke turn 1 plays. Your opponent tries to discard a baby plus another card. You chain this. It's going to resolve before the baby. Your opponent doesn't get the dragon from the deck, and their graveyard is not set up right. Your opponent summons the turn 1 rabbit. Wait for them to activate their effect, then chain this guy. You're getting 1-for-1s in that situation, so it's not like you're going plus, but at the same time, you can't activate this and then drop Gores on your opponent, or, activate Call of the Haunted during the battle phase or during the end phase or something to, like go nuts on your opponent during their next turn or something like that. So I think the card would be very balanced. Number 2 would be monsters that let you draw cards when you inflict battle damage. Konami has never really taken this effect seriously. I know that because, when was the last time they released 2 monsters with this effect in the same set? Like, you gotta go all the way back to fucking Legacy of Darkness. That was like 10 years ago. I guess it started with Mass Sorcerer back in Metal Raiders, I believe. And the card had 900 attack, which means it was never going to run over anything pretty much ever. And on the off chance that you got its effect off, it was a complete liability on the field, because your opponent could summon like their weakest monster and run it over. So it's like, what were you really accomplishing? Now, fast forward to Legacy of Darkness, and it was like, not only was that almost 2 years later, but Air Knight Parashaft was pretty decent for a little while. But the problem with Air Knight now is you have to spend 1 tribute to get him on the field. The game now, I think, is way too fast to ever be spending 1 tribute on a monster that has 1900 attack, unless it pretty much auto wins you the game, which this card does not. And that pretty much means if I'm not going to spend 1 tribute on this effect, then why in the hell would I ever spend 2 tributes on something like YAMATA Dragon, especially when it's going to put itself back in my hand during the end phase, making it, in my opinion, one of the most counterproductive cards in the history of Yu-Gi-Oh! Like, I think that this is one of those things that Konami just needs to simplify. I mean, give us a monster with 1900 attack that lets you draw cards when you inflict battle damage. Except just don't be retarded about it. Don't make it a dragon, a spellcaster, or a warrior, and it will be fine. You know, all they have to do is just make it something like a wind reptile or something like that. 1900 attack, 1400 defense. When it inflicts battle damage, you draw a card. I mean, some people look at that and they're just like, okay, you know, like, I see that as being pretty decent. It wouldn't have any synergy with any of the high tier decks, so you wouldn't have to worry about any of the broken decks, like, exploiting it. And even with an anti-meta deck, like, it really wouldn't stop your opponent from doing any of their plays, so I'm not really sure of how great of an anti-meta card it is. The best place I think it could fit in is just probably beatdown decks. I mean, it's a beat stick that when it does its job, it lets you draw a card. I mean, it gives you a bonus for running beat sticks. So I don't really see anything unfair or unbalanced with that card. I mean, beatdown decks can use all the help they can get. Number 3 would be spell negation cards. And this one really irks me because, for starters, we basically don't have that many in the game. Like, there just aren't that many spell negation cards. And it seems like all of the ones that we do have fall into 2 categories. Category 1, absolutely overpowered. Category 2, complete ass. I mean, obviously, you know, the cards that come to my mind are Spell Shield Type 8, Magic Drain, Magic Jammer, Imperial Order, and it's like, Imperial Order obviously is just Category 1, completely overpowered. You know, I think that they were thinking, well, we've got Pot of Greed and Regeki and Confiscation. We need ways to stop these cards. And then they were like, holy shit, 700 life points is not enough to stop your opponent from doing anything. Let's ban this card. And it was like, oh, wow. And then you had, you know, all these other renditions of this type of card, and it's like, either they don't completely stop the spell, like Magic Drain, to where, you know, would you ever risk your life on a Magic Drain if your opponent used Heavy Storm? Of course not, because if your opponent discards another spell, you probably lose. Or something like Magic Jammer, to where it's like I'm always going neg. And, you know, unless your opponent absolutely positively needs that spell to win, Magic Jammer is just complete ass. I mean, they tried to make it a little better with Spell Shield 8. You know, if it targeted a monster, then, you know, you didn't have to discard. But it was like, how many great targeting cards were out there? I mean, there was like Snatch Steal and Brain Control and stuff like that, but once those cards got banned, it was like, okay, this card became ass. So I think that my personal solution would be kind of make a mix between Imperial Order and Magic Jammer, because I think that you should be able to have spot on removal. I mean, if your opponent activates their most powerful spell, a card that you know is going to just absolutely butt rape you, like a Heavy Storm or a Dark Hole, you should be able to immediately answer that. Now, I think you should have a cost. You know, if the card is going to have a discard cost of, like, you know, discarding 1 card, then I think that it should give you more protection. Like, it should offer you more than just being able to negate 1 spell. I think the perfect solution would be kind of like a combination of Magic Jammer and Imperial Order. The card would function identical to Magic Jammer. It'd be a counter trap. It would still have the discard cost, you know, so it's still pretty balanced. It's a -1, but it would have the effect of, you know, for the rest of the turn, every spell that your opponent tries to activate is simply negated. And I like that because the way that we have Yu-Gi-Oh! Now, there are so many powerful spells. It's like, okay, who cares if you get rid of my Heavy Storm or if you get rid of my Monster Reborn? I've got a dozen other powerful spells that I'm going to use against you, and you can't stop all of those. You know, if you're playing against Prophecy and you have to Solemn their Spellbook of Judgment, I mean, they can just search another one for the next turn. I mean, you don't have another Solemn. If you're playing against Dark World and your opponent plays Dark World Dealings and you have to burn Lagia, okay, if they have another card, if they have card destruction or another dealings, you're probably going to lose if they discard a Grapha. You know, so no longer would you just get completely, you know, overwhelmed by these decks like Dark World and Prophecy that need to activate, you know, 8 spells in a turn to win. And no longer would you have to worry about, you know, oh, I negated my opponent's Monster Reborn, but now he's going to Heavy Storm me. You know, at least some of that brokenness would be curbed. Number 4 is cards that negate effects that can destroy cards in your hand. Now, I'm not talking about something like Chain Destruction. I'm more or less talking about the virus cards. You know, the fact of the matter is they are the most difficult cards to stop in the entire game of Yu-Gi-Oh! I say that because, to my knowledge, this game is almost 15 years old, and we have nothing that can stop them if your opponent is going first. You're just going to have to eat it. You know, it started with Crush Card Virus, and then we moved to Deck Devastation Virus to stop, you know, like Plant Synchro and Wind Up ships and stuff like that. And now we have ERADICATOR epidemic virus, which is going to stop things like burn and prophecy. The problem is, if your opponent goes first and they summon that monster and then they set the virus, you have no way of stopping it. I mean, you can't MST it. You can't get rid of the monster. I mean, your opponent can chain. They can activate it during your draw or standby phase. You just will flat out eat the virus, and there's no way of stopping it, and it just doesn't make any sense. You know, things like Gemini Imps only stop discards, but the virus cards destroy cards in your hand. So, you know, Gemini Imps can't be used against that. And I don't know why, but again, they keep on, you know, semi-limiting or banning or limiting the virus cards, but they don't seem to ever make any counter cards to the virus cards. I mean, I don't understand why they don't just make a card that is specific to cards being destroyed in the hand, very similar to Gemini Imps, and give it pretty much the same effect. I mean, if your opponent tries to activate a card effect that can destroy cards in your hand, you simply discard this card, negate the activation of that card, and destroy it, and then draw a card. I mean, that seems pretty good because, again, you can only use it against the virus cards, but it would be like, you know, okay, well, now my chain burn deck doesn't auto lose to E-Virus, you know, Prophecy doesn't auto lose to, you know, somebody who set Fuchsia Beast and then activated ERADICATOR epidemic virus. Like, I think if we're gonna have these powerful ass cards that are practically impossible to stop, that we should have at least one decent counter to them, right? And number 5 would be monsters that are specifically designed to counter Xyz monsters. I understand that, you know, Xyz monsters are Konami's cash cow right now. They're the bread and butter of the game right now. They're, you know, what's keeping Konami in the green, but I don't understand for the life of me why we don't have any monsters specifically designed to stop these motherfuckers. I mean, Trifortress Ops was practically a fucking embarrassment. I mean, when they gave it that whole, it loses 500 defense, I was like, what the hell? But, I mean, look at Synchros. Like, Synchros were basically the same things as Xyz, but they released a couple of counter cards. You know, they had the MEKLORDs, which could, you know, suck up Synchros. They had, you know, Black Shiny Sea, which if it was in your graveyard, you could remove it and you would instantly kill a Synchro. So it kind of limited the cards your opponent could summon. I mean, they kind of like had to either make a Synchro that they didn't want or like make Stardust, but we don't really have anything to counter Xyz. Like, I don't understand why we don't have something like, you know, a Black Shiny Sea, but for Xyz monsters. And instead of just destroying it, like, banish it. I mean, we all know that Mecha Phantom Beast Dracosack is a problem. And if it had, you know, just simply destroy, a lot of monsters would not die to that. You know, you'd have things like Gachi that could protect themselves, or Dracosack that could protect themselves. You know, this would also go for like Zemains. I mean, there are a lot of Xyz monsters that have protection from destruction, you know, in comparison to Synchros, where it was kind of like just Stardust, you know. So I think we need something out there. I mean, they release MEKLORDs and all these other things to counter Synchros, and when it comes to Xyz, they ain't releasing shit. And Xyz are way easier to make because you don't have to run tuners. Like, you can just run anything and make Xyz, you know. So I don't know if they just were just like, man, you know, we want Xyz to make sure that they dominate everything, but I think that we need at least a couple of counter monsters out there. So let me know what you guys think of this top 5. Thank you for watching, and have a nice day. Subscribing makes life happy.